On today's show, we are talking all things Hakeem Olajuwon with Mirin, the author of Dream, the life and legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. It's all coming up on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best ways that you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, like and subscribe on YouTube, as well as do a drive-by, drop your comments, just say Go Rockets. It helps us out a ton. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Joining us now is a very, very special guest, senior staff writer for The Ringer, New York Times best-selling author, and author of Dream, the life and legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. Mirin, Mirin, we are so excited to have you here on the program to discuss your latest project, this absolutely incredible book that I've already read cover to cover.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Look, we're going to unpack and kind of get into the story of how this book came about, your writing process, everything that went into this book. I want to start first with, a little bit of background on you for any of our audience who's unfamiliar with you, unfamiliar with your work, just to get, kind of an introduction to you first and foremost.
Sure. Yeah, I write long form stories that are really, really long, like 4,000 words long. I love writing about who athletes are as people. What did they get through to get here? Who are they off the court? What are parts of their stories that people don't know? What kind of drive, determination, what kind of community helped them get to where they are? So I cover all sports, but mainly NBA. And yeah, my first book was on Giannis Antetokounmpo, and it seemed like a natural progression to Dream for a lot of reasons. But I just love telling stories that are about more than just, somebody scored 20 points.
And I think that's one of the most fascinating things about really any sport, but it feels like almost in particular in basketball, right? There's so many almost like larger than life personalities and stories to be told about who these people are outside of just the game of basketball itself.
Right. Yeah. And also, if we don't tell these stories, I'm afraid they'll be forgotten. Like there's so many legends that have passed away just in the last couple of months. And I just keep thinking to myself, imagine how many stories they took with them. It's almost like history, nostalgia. These things are so important. We love the NBA, but we need to also study those that came before.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I love that this book about Hakeem Olajuwon gets such, an in-depth kind of look at his upbringing, at his life, coming over from Africa, just the almost kind of the culture shock and the adjustment period. And it doesn't just follow him as a basketball player. It dives deep into his family, the people that were around him, all the people that kind of helped him become who we know him as today. And the book kind of starting right with his childhood, his upbringing in Lagos in Nigeria. And this might be common knowledge to many, but it might be news to some, right? Hakeem was not always a basketball player. He picked up basketball much later in life than many of his peers, than many other people who'd been playing the game ever since they were young children. And he had to be actually persuaded into playing basketball. It was not like an easy thing. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I'm tall, I'll just go play basketball. It was, no, I don't really think that's for me.
Yeah, 100%. The coolest part was getting to interview his coaches from that era, who are now in their 80s, and former teammates who are also now in their 60s. And basically, they described how he turned down these coaches time after time. They'd say, Hakeem, you got to come to practice. Please come play basketball. And he's like, no. And so it was like multiple times they were trying to get him to come, and he said no. And then he finally says yes, but he's like, I'm not leaving my other sports behind. So people know that he played football, aka American soccer, what we call it. But He was also an excellent handball player. And so he would go to his handball tournaments and then have to leave early to get transported to the basketball court so he could play in those basketball tournaments. But it took him many months to say, okay, I'm just going to focus on basketball.
I thought one of the funniest kind of like anecdotes from the book was the agreement that his coaches would have to share him in between games. That like one coach would get him for the first half of their game, and then he would go hop on the bus and go to the other game, and then they'd get him for the second half of that game between basketball, handball, soccer. All it was kind of ridiculous.
I love that. Like, can you imagine like gangly teenage Hakeem who like legs hanging off the side of a little motor cart and just getting to the game? And to me also, now knowing what I know about him, that speaks to the competitor. It's like, I will not miss a handball game just because I'm trying out this new sport. I will not miss a second. If I have to go from here to there, I'm still going to play my hardest before they tell me to leave the court. It's the most him anecdote.
And him being so involved in those two sports, in particular soccer and handball, were easily some of the things that led to his very distinct and unique play style as he did grow and adapt as a basketball player, right? He didn't have the natural upbringing. He wasn't told from a young age, oh, you're tall, you're going to be a brute force, you're going to be a big bruising big man. No, he had aspirations of playing the game differently, and he did just that. But one of the other things that stood out about when you were revisiting and going through kind of his childhood, his early years, is that he was ashamed of his height for a very long time, that he felt different. He felt alienated from his peers. And he would, there were the lines that stand out, right? He would shrink himself down in doorways to try and make himself smaller.
Yeah. And it was really hard because the kids would bully him and there was no escaping. Like you couldn't just like not show up to school. And if you didn't show up, there would be this huge dip and people would know like there's no Hakeem, like where's the tall guy? And he got quite emotional. I mean, sometimes he would go and cry about it. And it's really hard because it wasn't like it is today where if you're a tall person, people automatically are like, yeah, you're going to go to the NBA. For him, being tall was not seen as like this gift or this, path to future superstardom. It was something that made him seem odd to other people. It made him seem not cool. And he just wanted to hide. He hated getting called on in class.
Yeah, it was that kind of like, I guess, deep dive look into his upbringing. And obviously like the other part too that really stood out is basketball wasn't ever viewed as like, this ticket to, a better life or anything like that. It was an extracurricular activity, one that he clearly didn't have a ton of interest in from the jump, and had to be persuaded into kind of pursuing. But his parents, his siblings, everyone around him, right? The goal was to pursue a higher education. That was always first and foremost in Hakeem's life, was he needed to achieve a higher education in order to, achieve a better life for himself and for his family.
Yeah, his older siblings were such an example. He had a sister that studied at the American University in Cairo. And so, making straight A's, being a great student, being a model student, that was really important. And it was always known like, hey, you go abroad to get your education, come back, get a good job. And so sports was like an afterthought. It was like, what do you mean you want to go kick a ball around like the field? Like, what are you doing? Why you're not doing your homework? And so it was never seen as like this great ticket or this great, leading to a future. Honestly, it wasn't until like, I would say midway through Hakeem's like rookie year in the NBA, after all he achieved in college, were his parents like, okay, I understand the path you're taking. I think this is a good idea.
Coming up, the mystery of how Hakeem Olajuwon made it to America and eventually became a UH Cougar. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you actually place your bets. You get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Head on over to FanDuel.com and take a look at all the different wagers available, division winners, season awards, who the outright favorites are to win the Super Bowl. Right now, the Kansas City Chiefs plus 500, the 49ers plus 650, right behind them the Ravens at plus 750, and then a three-way tie, the Lions, the Bills, and your Houston Texans plus 1100 to win it all this season. So for all those odds and so much more, head on over to FanDuel.com. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Let's go ahead and dive back into our conversation with Mirin Fader. and it was under a year, right? Within a year, he had played, and then he was being scouted and being looked at as by colleges all across America. And then there was the story, all the mystique, the confusion, whatever you want to call it, of his coming to America and eventually joining Guy Lewis at the University of Houston. But can you shed some light on kind of trying to unearth the truth of what happened there? Because there's the story everybody knows is that, okay, Guy Lewis didn't even send a taxi to go pick up Hakeem at the airport, but you kind of unearthed there's a lot more that kind of went into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are a Cougar fan, you probably know the story, which is somehow there was this white coach that happened to be in Africa. His name was Chris Pond, and he sees Hakeem at this tournament. He's like, wow, you're so good. The next day they're at the embassy. The next day or whatever, Hakeem gets a visa. Then Hakeem is flying to America. He's got a visit at St. John's. One problem, though, he gets to the airport. It's so chilly at JFK. He's like, I can't stay here. I've got to go to the Houston. So then he goes to Houston. Guy Lewis doesn't even bother to bring a cab because he's not a prized recruit. And then all of a sudden, Hakeem turns into a superstar. And then they go to the Final Fours. They're Phi Slamma Jamma. What an amazing origin story. The problem is that a lot of it really isn't true. And that came from a lot of the reporting that I did in the book, where I did a FOIA request to find out about Chris Pond. Turns out, as many claimed at the time, he actually didn't work for the State Department. He might have been a freelancer, a contract employee, but he was not a, quote, State Department official, as a lot of Houston people at the time claimed. St. John's actually never recruited Olajuwon. There was never supposed to be a visit. I interviewed the coaches who are still alive, and they were like, we had no communication with Chris Pond. Same with the other schools that Chris Pond claimed that he arranged visits for. So, because Chris Pond has passed, and I spoke with his only surviving sibling, it's unclear if he was trying to, make himself seem like a better all-world recruiter, something that didn't really exist in those days, if he wanted to, boast about what he could do for Olajuwon. But even though Olajuwon had plane tickets to these places, because that's what Chris Pond arranged to him, Chris Pond actually had no contact with these schools. I interviewed all the surviving coaches, and none of them remember any contact with him. So essentially, it's just turned into a myth, and it's a really good story, which is why nobody's really interrogated it. And a lot of the reporters at the time, I asked them, why didn't anybody ask any questions, how this all went down? And they're like, people kind of like the mystique of it. They really like that he just sort of, quote, came from nowhere and got here, but there was a clumsiness to it. And so of course, I've got to investigate the origin story. That's at the heart of what people know about him.
And it again, it kind of it helped contribute to the curiosity around who this guy was. He shows up out of nowhere. And I wrote this quote down because I thought this was one of my favorite quotes from reading the book. Donnie Cheverak, I believe. And can you remind me his position with U of H at the time?
He was the assistant coach and very close to Guy Lewis.
There we go. So Donnie, when Hakeem did arrive, at the facility, the line from Donnie saying Hakeem just kept getting out of the cab, kept getting out. It looked like somebody unfurled him like a flag, and they were immediately blown away because they expected him to show up and not live up to, oh, he's not actually 6'10", he's not as big, he's not going to be what Chris Pond is kind of hyping him up to be for us. And then Guy Lewis turns to Donnie. He's like, go get his bags. He's go get him right now.
Right. Yeah. Jay Goldberg, the SID at the time, was like, I have never seen Guy Lewis's eyes get so big. It's just funny because it's in that moment, do they know he's going to turn into what he turned into? No. But they're looking at him and they're like, oh my God, what just landed on our doorstep?
And then the next few years, right? The eventual, what turned into the tallest fraternity in the country, Phi Slamma Jamma, those were some really incredible years. And the fact that team never actually wound up winning a title, is I think collegiately probably is one of, the biggest kind of what ifs, or just how close they actually were able to come with Hakeem as the man in the middle, still incredibly raw in his talent, right? I mean, you go through the anecdotes, the recollections from that time, he was still just learning the sport at the beginning of his basketball journey, and yet he was already such a dominating presence in the game itself.
Yeah, think about that. He was going to be, the unanimous number one pick, despite the fact that he really was not polished offensively at all. He was just this incredible shot blocker and defender, and his instincts were just impeccable. Like rebounding, like he ran the floor so well. He just did all these things you couldn't teach. But it was so clear. You're like, okay, this guy, he could be great. He could be great.
And that was, I think that was a recurring theme. It felt like a recurring theme throughout the book is yes, Hakeem was an incredible basketball player, but he wasn't always an incredible basketball player. He worked at it. But the reason that his career kind of panned out the way that it is at his heart, he is a competitor above all else, competitive in almost every aspect of his life, and that competitive drive was so clear and evident to coaches, to fellow players, to people that were around him. They all throughout your book, they highlight just how competitive he was.
I 100% agree. I mean, there's normal competitiveness and then there's dream competitiveness, which is just on a completely different level. It's just you are going to have to go through me to beat me. Like, I absolutely love that. But the other thing is he doesn't just get better because of sheer competitiveness or drive or work ethic, which all those things he had in droves. He got better because of a community of mentors. Like, I wanted this book to really give flowers to so many other Rockets, Moses Malone, Carol Dawson, who just passed away, the former GM and assistant coach, as well as a Nigerian superstar named Yomi Sangodeyi. There are these people throughout Hakeem's career that worked with him daily and mentored him and taught him. That's how he grew. It's absurd to pick up the game at 17 and then be an NBA All-Star like 3 years later. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And he just took off.
I loved hearing about the impact that Yomi had on him, and also just some of the early battles with Moses Malone at the Fondy Rec Center. Shout out to all the Houstonians listening to this podcast if you remember Fondy. So see, this is the thing, is like I'm also on the younger end of Houston Rockets fans. So like I was born during the Rockets' second title run. So I'm I guess late to the party. I didn't get to experience Hakeem Olajuwon live. I didn't get to, I didn't start falling in love with the game of basketball until I was, my introduction to the team was the Stevie franchise era Rockets, and then really falling in love with it around the T-Mac and Yao era of the team. So, obviously I've done my research. I've gone back. I've watched the games. I've lived it, and experienced it in a different way than many other people who were fans at the time. But this book takes, another deep dive, or a better deep dive into just kind of following his story. And it's a great exposure, I think, to me and to any younger Rockets fans to really get a good look at Houston's crown jewel of athletes. I mean, he's the guy for Houston sports.
This is actually a major reason why I wrote the book. I feel like if somebody is 30 and under, they really don't know Olajuwon's story, and they don't know how incredible he is. I'm not from Houston, but just the respect that I have for him and the admiration, it always bothered me when he was left off of all-time great lists. I mean, he is criminally underrated. It's unbelievable the way that he is almost forgotten. And not by current NBA players, not by former NBA players. The reverence they have for him is just outstanding. The LeBrons and the Kobe Bryants and the Giannis's of the world, like the respect they have for Hakeem is incredible. But the casual, average basketball fan has no idea how incredible Hakeem Olajuwon was. And so I wanted to bring this story up to the present tense to show that not only was he incredible in his own right, which he was, but everything you see in the NBA right now, from positionless basketball to the emergence of the fact that international superstars dominate this game, African superstars dominate this game, there's a pioneer who started all that, and that's Dream. And he never gets the credit, and he doesn't want the credit. He doesn't seek the credit, but people need to know the impact that he had on our game.
I want to reiterate this point, but in a much more blunt fashion. Mirin Fader is calling out all the casuals. Stop being casuals. That's what's happening right now. No, I couldn't agree more. I just couldn't say it as eloquently as you could. Look, I do think that next chapter though, literally speaking about chapters, right? Graduating from the University of Houston and deciding to ultimately take his talents to the NBA. It was so poetic, right? That the Rockets were the team that were able to select him, right? The only other home besides Lagos that he had known in his life up to that point. And he got to stay in Houston and continue to grow and cultivate his basketball talent and take his next step into his NBA journey.
It's incredible. And think of this, that to this day, in the year of 2024, you never hear people say, oh man, like the Rockets should have taken Jordan. That's amazing. Like that just speaks to Hakeem's, not just his dominance, but like the impact on the city of Houston. Like that doesn't get talked about enough. And sports media loves to be like, imagine if so-and-so went here, if they went there. And, you see the occasional article from time to time, but it's never like, oh, I can't believe the Rockets did that. It just really speaks to just how beloved he is in this community.
You did get the chance to explore some of those what if scenarios in the book, the possibility of a Olajuwon and Michael Jordan duo in Houston. My goodness, that would have been something to see.
Right. Well, I just love it. It was great talking with like Rod Thorne and Mike Tebow and like the people that were intimately involved in the Bulls' scouting, and they were just like, no question, if we had the number one pick, we're taking Olajuwon. I mean, after all they know about what Jordan would do, they're like, yeah, no question. At the time, we were like, we're taking Olajuwon.
Yeah, and that honestly, credit to them for being honest about it. Like again, it was a center-driven league. Again, guards were not looked at with the reverence that they are in today's NBA. The game hadn't quite modernized to that point yet. But even again, a testament to Hakeem's greatness that at no point in time did anybody ever look back and be, man, the Rockets made a mistake. They should have taken Jordan. No, Hakeem was still and still is to this day the right pick for the organization. Now the Blazers kind of missed a little bit in there, but that's a conversation for another day. Coming up, Hakeem's career struggles on his way to becoming a champion, reconnecting with Islam, and so much more. We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Let's go ahead and dive back into our conversation with the Ringers, Mirin Fader. I guess I didn't realize, I never really realized, I knew that, from hearing about it, from stories from like my dad and whatnot, like Hakeem was kind of plagued early through his career, right? And part of that was just he was really aggressive. Like he was not the, I guess, kind, calm, like tempered, man that we see today or that you saw, later in his career. He had a lot of growing up to do when he made it to the NBA.
A lot of people, unless again they were not born during that time, didn't watch basketball in that era, don't realize that like his temper was so quick. I mean, Robert Reed, who actually just passed as well, told me for the book, he was like, Dream had a temper, and he said, I mean, he was hell. And Hakeem even admitted too at the time. He said, I admit I have a temper. I really think, though, it is the competitiveness that you outlined before, because if you look at a lot of the fights that he was in, he wasn't the instigator, and he did get a lot of ejections. But what I got some players at the time to admit, especially the Sonics guards, especially Michael Cage, great interview. He was like, we fouled the crap out of him, and we had to do it on purpose because we knew we couldn't stop him. So we had to, it was like the Jordan rules, but the dream rules, And so Hakeem was not just going up to people and getting into fights. They would goad him because they knew that he had this temper, and they would get him out of his element and push him, and the refs wouldn't call anything. And at that point, he's like, you're not just going to push me and I'm just going to lay over with it. Like, that's not cool. You need to respect me. And so he would hit them, and then he would get caught. So, it wasn't like he was out there making the first move, but the person who responds always gets caught. And so he was still known as this like amazing basketball player, but he hadn't quite reached that full potential yet. Half of it, he wasn't in the game for a lot of, the ends at times. And he started to realize that like, okay, I might be successful, but I feel spiritually empty. There's something missing here. And all of these troubles that I'm going through on the court, off the court, like something's got to give.
And that was where I really, really deeply enjoyed this part of the book, exploring kind of the darker years for Hakeem, right? Where he felt so disconnected from his home, from his religion, from the life that he had before coming to America. And we have, here, the fact that this book goes into such a deep dive into Islam and the culture and kind of everything that it meant to him was really, I thought it was really enlightening. It was really cool. One of our, routine weekly co-hosts here at the program, Ali Kambajani, he's a proud Muslim. And so kind of seeing that side of Hakeem and how important it was, not just to him personally, right, off the court stuff, but how it also impacted and elevated his game when he did reconnect with his roots and was able to reestablish himself, and realign himself with his religious beliefs.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. And I really like that you use the word reconnect, because one of the things when we talk about myths and the way that his story hasn't, really been understood through the years is people wrongly say that he converted to Islam. And he never converted. He was raised Muslim, and he abandoned his faith for the next decade or so, and then he returned to it. This reconnection, as Matt Bullard, longest tenured teammate, told me, it wasn't like one day he was getting ejected and then he woke up the next day a saint. It was a gradual process of like a person just growing up, a boy coming into a man. And I thought that was really important, because this is the value of books. You get to see how a person evolves. We're not supposed to say the same. We all know Hakeem as this like very regal man. He's almost otherworldly in the sense when you see him, you're just in awe of him. There's a respect and there's a quiet confidence that he carries himself with. But people need to know that was not always how he was, and he came a really long way, and a lot of people helped him get there. That's what I think is the heart of the book, is like nobody makes it alone. It's community.
Now, one of the other areas that Hakeem is most well known for, obviously, and the name is on the cover of the book itself, but his patented and famous Dream Shake. And
Right.
We've actually had the story told here once before by none other than Rockets legendary broadcaster Bill Worrell, who's been a guest on the show previously. So he got to share kind of his side of the story in the inception of the Dream Shake kind of moniker. But walk us through kind of, what you learned about how the Dream Shake kind of came to be.
Yeah, well, he was a great interview for this book as well. And he just kept sort of looking at the way Olajuwon would move and pivot. And he was like, I got to come up with something. Like, how do I describe this? And he sort of was like coming up with some, shake and bake, like the usual things. He's like, nah, that doesn't do it. And then it just sort of came to him like mixing in a blender, like something, there's movement. And he was like, the shake, it's something with the shake. And then he's like, got to have Dream in there. And I thought it was so cute. He asked Dream at the airport, like, what do you think of this nickname before I use it? And he was like, I like that. That's good. So I think that was really, he had to get the stamp of approval first.
and what's so cool, and this extends, and this kind of idea permeates throughout the whole book, that Hakeem is so much, he's made up of so many other people, right? So many other influences on his life. I mean, you go to when he won his first MVP award, right? And he brought his teammates out onto the court, his teammates and his coaches, to accept the award with him, because he was like, basketball is a team game, right? And the same thing goes for the Dream Shake. It wasn't just a move that Hakeem Olajuwon came up with. It wasn't something that he did. It was a little bit of Yami. It was a little bit of Moses. It was, and I could be wrong. I'm going off rip here, so I'm trying to remember. But I believe you had a line in there somewhere about it was a rich tapestry of different influences that led to it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, along with the origin story, kind of figuring out where the Dream Shake came from was one of the bigger revelations of the book. And, as you just kind of alluded to, I mentioned how it's sort of an amalgamation of a bunch of things. It's like there's there's Carol Dawson, CD, and his post-move clinics every day. There's, the influence of handball, something we don't talk about enough. People only focus on the football influence, but handball is part of it. But the one thing that people don't know is that a lot of the Dream Shake came from Yomi Sangodeyi, the Nigerian superstar that I mentioned. He passed away during COVID, but he is a FIBA Hall of Famer. He was Olajuwon's hero. They remained great friends up until Yomi's death. Spoke with Yomi's wife, and she was like, they're like brothers. So, Hakeem saw Yomi doing this shake growing up. And I asked the former coaches and teammates, and they all agreed that Yomi was shaking people. And so it appears that a lot of the shake, perhaps some of that innovation comes from Yomi. So it's not one source, but it is a bunch of different sources together. And that's why, back to giving people flowers, it's like, I love the fact that some of it came from Nigeria because, I think because Hakeem was such a success in America, people called him the American dream. They really forgot about Nigeria and how, talented he was and how amazing the players around him were that made him better. And so I just really wanted to make that clear to the reader that like the influence on him, it wasn't just his American mentors, it was people back home as well.
And in following Hakeem's journey, right? Oftentimes when we look at sports, right, there's the old adage, right? You have to pay your dues. You have to do some losing before you can do your winning. And obviously the Rockets had their trip to the 1986 NBA Finals where they faced the Boston Celtics. That was during the Twin Towers era with Ralph Sampson, Hakeem in the front court, and they ultimately lost that series. And then the Rockets went into kind of the down years, which kind of directly coincided with kind of the darker years for Hakeem before he reconnected with Islam. And then it was a new version of Hakeem, right, that began to understand to win at the highest of levels. He had to trust his teammates. He had to really embody the idea of team basketball. And it took a lot of work from, Rudy T and from his teammates to get him to kind of open up and understand, hey, if you trust us, like, we're going to get there together, right? And once he got to that point, that was when he elevated himself to like peak Hakeem levelness, because that was when he could actually, like, he wasn't just out there he wasn't just out there dominating the game by himself. He was out there elevating his whole team.
Yeah, that's right. I think that there's also a couple other factors involved too, is that, speaking with his former coach before Rudy T took over, Don Chaney, he was saying that like Olajuwon really struggled to pass out of the double team because, he felt like, well, I can still score on two. I kick it out for the wide open three and my teammate misses it. Why shouldn't I go inside? It's like, well, the man has a point. But he had to have better teammates around him that could knock down that shot. So yes, it is about trusting teammates, but also he just needed better teammates, I gotta say. And so I think the thing with Rudy is like, they upgraded, but that was not a superstar team, but it was the right team around him. And it was a coach who knew how to put people in positions to succeed and use the personnel to help Olajuwon succeed rather than, the first coach that Olajuwon had, Bill Fitch. It was very much my way or the highway. So, what Rudy T did was so special, and it allowed Olajuwon to thrive. But you know what? He suffered through a lot of really bad years, and the talent level was not commensurate with his. And he had to learn the hard way of patience.
Yeah, we look at Hakeem as, a guy who really modernized the center position, led to a lot of what we see in today's game, the positionless basketball, a guy on the court who could do a little bit of everything. But we also, a lot of credit has to be given to Rudy T and how he helped also kind of modernize the game. One of the first coaches to go with kind of a 4-out system, right, to really help Hakeem, to allow him the space to operate in the post and put 4 guys on the perimeter around him, which just, modernized and revolutionized the Rockets offense back in the 90s.
Yeah. And, Rudy was such a great interview, too, because he was like, look, I've seen Hakeem from his evolve throughout the years. Rudy was an assistant coach and / head scout with the Rockets when Hakeem was in his early years. And when Hakeem would get ejected from the game, it was Rudy that had to take him back to the locker room and calm him down. So just there was a trust there between those two. And by the time, Dream is older and their chances is now to win, they were just like the perfect match. They trusted each other. I love that. And the one thing Rudy said that I thought really stood out was we talk about so much about, Hakeem's faith, but actually what people don't know, which is what Rudy told me, is that Hakeem getting more religious caused Rudy to think more spiritually and think more about his own faith, which is so fascinating when like the student helps the teacher.
Absolutely. When you kind of look back and think about kind of the process of going through and writing this book, what's something that maybe stood out to you or surprised you the most as you were navigating this process?
God, the god-awful racism and Islamophobia that Olajuwon experienced, that people don't talk about at all. I mean, there was a 1995 editorial from the New York Times with sorry, my dog is barking.
That's okay. We're dog friendly on the podcast. Sorry. It's all good.
I'm telling my dad to just stop. Anyway, I'm so sorry. What was I just saying?
Facing racism and Islamophobia.
There was a 1995 editorial, the New York Times, and it was basically like, why is Olajuwon so successful, right? He just won his second NBA title, and yet the major endorsements elude him. And it had so many dog whistles in this editorial about basically saying executives prefer an American person without an accent. We don't even know how to say his name. And I was just getting so many echoes of Giannis, right? It's like sadly, it's like the same language we use today about, oh, we can't pronounce Giannis's name. Ridiculous. So I'm not surprised, but I am, I'm saddened by it. The other thing that I thought was fascinating is like when Dream goes to Toronto, it's kind of like an afterthought in his career. It's kind of like, okay, that year was weird. Why was he in purple? It's just very sad for Houstonians. But 9/11 happened right before he left. And I spend that chapter talking with a lot of Muslims in Toronto who talked about the way that he really stood up for the community, helped fund mosques, helped university students that couldn't find prayer rooms. Like he really played such an important role there. And I know that his basketball career was on the downswing and his body was beginning to betray him, but people really need to realize what he did in that community. And, Hakeem does not like praise. He does not like to talk about what he, does. And that's why, he will donate to a million causes and you'll never see press releases about it because in his religion, it's about him and Allah. It's not for praise. It's not for show. But I think people should really know that his impact on so many communities across the world, even I get into his impact in Amman, Jordan, is astounding.
It's really interesting because you go back to how there were so many people early in his life that tried to help him embrace and not be ashamed, right, of just his height, right, something that he couldn't change about himself, and then later in life when he was reconnected with Islam, when he was proudly like kind of a I don't want to say a sponsor, that's not the right word for it, a kind of an ambassador for the religion, right, worldwide. Right. How suddenly there were young Muslim boys and girls who looked up to him and saw somebody that reflected their beliefs, their ideals, somebody that they could connect with. And that permeates through so many different communities. And it was really, and going back to the kind of the racism and kind of Islamophobia and kind of xenophobia kind of stuff that he dealt with, it's kind of ridiculous that it was so far reaching all the way back to even like his collegiate days, right? So much so to the point that he had to, and this was, I selfishly, I kind of was like, oh, this is a cool little anecdote, despite like the tone of it being weird because of the reasoning behind it, but him publishing like a letter in the Daily Cougar, because I'm an alum from the Daily Cougar. I wrote for the school newspaper, so like I was like, wow, we both wrote for the same paper, we attended the same university. Like that was kind of a cool moment for me, but it was also just, I don't know, it's sad, but at the same time how he handled all of it with such grace, right? It goes back to even just how Hakeem came about, because he didn't want to come to America and immediately start correcting people and, oh, my name's Hakeem. It's just, he just rolled with it when he got there, and people thought his name was Hakeem, and he stuck with it for years until he had reconnected with Islam and decided, no, like my name is Hakeem. It's important to me. I need people to know that that's my name.
Yeah, I thought it was so important to get into that. And, just discovering that, in my reporting that it was a secretary that made the mistake with his name, and he never corrected anyone. And probably because, as his former teammates suggest, that, didn't want to ruffle feathers, didn't want to look disrespectful. It's extraordinary, the piece that you were talking about from the Daily Cougar. That was one of my favorite things that I found in the reporting of the whole book, because you see such vulnerability in that passage that he wrote. You see such honesty. He was talking about how people think he's stupid because he's from Nigeria and they have no idea his culture. They don't understand what he's going through. And I just thought, it's so important to talk about that, because in the glitz and glamour of Phi Slamma Jamma and, the later Rockets titles, those things aren't talked about when you talk about the legacy of him, but it is important, and it honestly makes me respect him more, because he was so talented and so, like you said, handled things with such grace when others, were truly ignorant and did not always treat him with respect.
Was there anything that you found along the way in writing Dream that maybe didn't make it into the final copy of the book?
Originally the Chris Pond chapter was so long. I ended up cutting it by like 30 pages.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, because I realized I just couldn't, I was going so deep in the weeds with it, and it just started. You
were down the Chris Pond rabbit hole is what you were.
Yeah, oh my God. It turned into like a whole like investigative thing, and the tone was just off, and it just I just went way too far with that because Chris Pond, like, he continued to try to find the next Olajuwon for the rest of his life. And it was actually a really interesting diatribe. Up until the day he died, he literally was like, I'm going to go back and find the next Olajuwon. So there was just so much there that was like disturbing, but that just took away from the central theme of Hakeem. And I also didn't want to center, a white person who brags about just quote discovering an athlete. That's just so problematic in so many ways. So I was like, that does not deserve airtime. The other thing was trying to get into the Rockets tanking because the Olajuwon draft really was the last draft before it changed. And that's because of the allegations of tanking to get Ralph Sampson and Olajuwon back to back. And all the surviving people, I really did get people to say, yeah, of course, like, that's a thing. Well, I definitely think the Rockets tanked, but you cannot prove that they tanked. You cannot prove that every single person on the team was trying to not win. So, there's speculation and there's people on the record. It's not the same thing as definitive proof. And so that was another like 30-page thing out the window. There's a lot of 30-page things going out the window in a book.
I can only imagine the writing process to come up with a book like this, and all the blood, sweat, and tears that went into this. But Mirin, this was, I tell you again, this was an absolutely fantastic read. I highly recommend it to any Rockets fans, really any NBA fans who want to, really get a better understanding of one of the greats to have, tackled this game, to have been a part of this game, and continue to give back to so many different communities, not just the basketball community, but the Muslim community around him and just everybody, right? The amount of love and gratitude that he gives back to everybody around him. I've had the honor to meet Hakeem on a couple different occasions, and he is always the most humble, kind-hearted, like gentle giant. Yeah. Like you would think anybody with that level of fame or stardom or whatever could walk in and just own whatever room they want. And he is so just down to earth, and he's just a regular guy. It's one of the coolest things.
I think that's one of the biggest things I learned while working on this is like, you can be so successful in life and you don't have to be an arrogant prick. Like he is such a testament to like, you can achieve. I think that line should have made it into the book somehow. You can be successful in life and you don't have to be an arrogant prick. There you go. I mean, it's rare. Am I right or am I right? Do we both work in sports? Like it's just like you can achieve so much and be so humble. You can achieve the pinnacle of success in athletics and keep your faith and identity. I think it's so opposite of everything and everyone I see today. The opposite of a self-promoter, the opposite of like, I need to be on social media and stay relevant, the opposite of, oh, I should be in these rankings. Let me start my own podcast to like showcase myself. And so people don't forget me, like he's just like so confident in his legacy and his skin. He's such an example to all of us. There are so many. We could spend many more hours sitting here talking about this book and all the different incredible anecdotes and pieces from it. It is a great piece of literature. Mirin, I want to give you one final chance. Just any parting message to any potential Rockets fans, NBA fans who are thinking about picking up a copy. Again, I've given it my recommendation, as have countless others. But any final messages or any final thoughts? And no, just thank you so much for taking the time. And it comes out October 15th. So if people would pick up a copy, I'd really appreciate it. That's going to do it for our special edition of Locked On Rockets with Mirin Fader, the author of Dream, the life and legacy of Hakeem Olajuwon. Be sure to grab yourself a copy of it, the link in the episode description. But as always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. And remember, best way to help our show out is to listen every single day, like and subscribe on YouTube, as well as dropping a comment in the comments section. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.